Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Space Station has been in orbit for almost 3 decades, and this week we found out a bit more about NASA's plan to deorbit the space station using a super version of the Dragon by SpaceX. And while I will talk about that, I actually want to address what will happen after the space station is no longer being used by NASA. On a video a couple of months ago, there was a set of comments from people who seemed to think that since NASA wasn't building a successor to the International Space Station, that once the ISS ended, then the only space station left in orbit would be the Chinese space station, and the US and Europe and Canada and Japan would have to send their people to China as space station instead. And that's obviously not the case.
That obviously is the case, and the reason for that is because NASA has never been able to put up their own space station. Literally, the Apollo mission was just a reaction to the Salyut program. No one was ever actually going to the moon. Apollo was launched with the intent to put Skylab in orbit after finding stable orbit for Skylab to be. However, they never found stable orbit. They couldn't create the technology to keep Skylab in orbit, and so while it was commissioned for 10 years, it was decommissioned after 24 weeks. It's like running 15 feet of a mile marathon and calling it a success. So as history shows very clearly, Skylab failed, and so NASA relied on Russia to try to help figure out how to do it. That was the Apollo-Soyuz mission, why they continued the Apollo missions after they decided to stop faking moon landings. And in the end, they couldn't be trusted, and so America was not a part of Mir. And so while they were blowing up people in '86 with the Challenger mission, Russia was successfully inhabiting space with their second 10-year-long commissioned space station. In 1993, when Russia was set to put up its third successful space station, NASA begged to be a part of it. In '98, they launched the International Space Station with a Proton rocket. It's the only thing that keeps the station in orbit, and if they take it away, the station falls to the Earth. Because bolting things to a station Russia's already put in orbit is not putting a station in orbit. So NASA needs to create a technology that they do not have, that they have tried to create before and failed at, and have been relying on Russia ever since. So not surprisingly, NASA is now faking another moon landing because they don't have the technology to inhabit low Earth orbit like Russia and China, and of course the only flex they can do to say we're better is to pretend we're going to the moon. But I can guarantee you they'll say they're too broke to do it in the end.
Because there are multiple US space station projects, it's just they're not being carried out by NASA, they're being carried out by private organizations.
And this is Scott talking out his ass again, because NASA has always been private contractors and will always be private contractors like SpaceX or Boeing or...
I honestly don't expect all of these to reach space. It's a very expensive business, and I'm not sure the market is big enough.
Which is ironic, because literally the whole reason America is decommissioning the International Space Station is because they claim they cannot afford it. They can't afford to make their own. They cannot afford to keep this one up.
And so this is a perfect jumping off point to talk about the first space station that will succeed the International Space Station. Succeed might be one word, survive might be even better, because Axiom Space Station is going to start out as a commercial extension to the International Space Station.
I'm not sure how many different ways they can all describe and say they don't have or possess the technology to inhabit space like Russia or China, and that they're trying desperately to create this technology so they can keep up with Russia or China, all while admitting they're too broke to afford being able to keep the International Space Station in space or put up their own space station in space. They have to sketch the previous station because they don't have the technology or the money to invest in the technology.
So this is partially funded by NASA. There's like $140 million, but most of it comes from private investors. There's 3 modules are built, and then there's a power and thermal module that's attached. There's also a super wide-angle version of the cupola, because of course they're going to be selling this to tourists who just want to experience the Earth in complete immersive view. And so while it's going to use the International Space Station to enable its construction, providing power and the services of the robotic arm, once the space station is going to be decommissioned, the Axiom segment can depart and become a separate module flying on its own.
And there you go again, admitting that you guys don't have the technology or the abilities to put your own space station in orbit. And the best you can do is spend years sketching and trying to create the technology on a station Russia's put in orbit already, in hopes that you can figure out what they've done. How is this not the Apollo-Soyuz mission again? And that you'll be able to then detach it and create your own station off of their station, which is still not putting your own station in orbit. And that's the best you can do.
And I've also heard that it may actually choose to take some parts of the International Space Station with it, although I haven't heard anything concrete. But the station that stands the best chance of getting to orbit first is Vast's Haven space station. This is a vastly simplified system. It is a single module launched on a single launch. It's much closer to the original Salyut station. Now, Vast appeared a few years ago. They were founded by a guy called Jeb McCaleb, who pretty much made a ton of money on Bitcoin. He started up one of the first crypto exchanges. And their initial plans were way more ambitious. Giant modules launched on Starship that would form a spinning station that could provide artificial gravity. In the meantime, they also acquired a company called Launcher, which was working on a small rocket, but obviously that market isn't there. And now they're going for this small space station. And the pitch is pretty simple. If you've got a private spaceflight on a Dragon, you've not got that much room to move around, you've got limited life support, well, why not dock it to a somewhat larger spacecraft in orbit? You get a bit more room to stretch your legs. And the station doesn't need to be amazingly complicated. It can actually use the spacecraft, the Dragon's life support capability, just with a bit more consumables added. So this vehicle is going to be about 10 meters long, 3.8 meters wide. It will handily fit on top of a Falcon 9. It could be preloaded with up to 150 kilograms of cargo, and that could be scientific experiments, space manufacturing, or party supplies if that's your jam. But this isn't like the International Space Station. It's not going to be permanently occupied. There's only one docking port, so once the spacecraft leaves, the crew has to go with it. But it looks simple enough that I could see it launching before any of the Axiom segments. They are already building test structures to verify that their design is going to work. And I'm sure they haven't forgotten about those larger space stations. They've just recalibrated towards using something which it could be here now, rather than something that could be here by the end of the decade. So the next one is Starlab, and it is a little further out. It is part of NASA's commercial LEO destinations program, which meant that they got a bunch of money, about $140 million, I believe, to develop their technology and proposals, potentially for NASA to visit after they've launched it. Now, this is initially a collaboration between NanoRacks, Voyager Space, and Lockheed Martin, but since then, Lockheed have dropped out, Northrop Grumman has come on board, and Airbus is now a major partner in this. Now, this is slightly more ambitious than what Vast is doing. It does include a manipulator arm, includes the airlock, which of course NanoRacks have already developed for the International Space Station. While the initial design only includes the power module and the habitation module, they do look like they have the potential to expand this in the future should there be demand. And it supports multiple docking ports, so it could be permanently habited, it could have crew coming and going, and it could have your cargo spacecraft delivering new consumables and materials. In particular, Northrop Grumman are developing a version of their Cygnus spacecraft, which would be able to automatically dock to a target station rather than requiring the manipulator arm to grab it and put it in place on the docking adapter. And speaking of docking adapters, I noticed that some of these renders include Russian-style Soyuz docking adapters in addition to international docking adapters and the common berthing adapters. So it seems they might have put those on there to pitch to as many customers as possible, but honestly, I don't see Russia being interested. So this design's pressure module is 8 meters wide. It provides a volume of 450 cubic meters. That's about half of the International Space Station, but that's from a single launch. But that single launch has to happen on a Starship-class launch vehicle. And that also means that Dragon is the most likely spacecraft to be delivering crew to this station. And while I was looking for Starlab footage, I did find this Airbus Loop concept, which looks very, very similar. And since they are partners on this, I expect there'd be a lot of commonality. 8-meter module with multiple levels in there. So that's a good reference point. Anyway, moving onwards, the other one is the vastly more ambitious orbital reef. This is a Blue Origin-led concept.
You think it is that the U.S. government basically has receded a bit and entrepreneurs have the opportunity to do it? Do you think there's some way to recapture the U.S. government's interest in this?
Well, I think if you think back to the heyday of the 1960s and the Apollo program and all of that excitement, my gut instinct on this is that we as a civilization, we as humanity, pulled that moon landing way forward, out of sequence from where it actually should have been. It was a gigantic effort with what is, in many ways, it should have been impossible. And they pulled it off with barely any computational power. They were still using slide rules. They couldn't numerically model in computers a lot of these important processes like combustion inside a rocket engine, which is still hard today, but we can do it a little bit. They didn't have computational fluid dynamics to really, everything had to be done in a wind tunnel. Nothing could be done on a computer. So I think the reason we've sort of taken a hiatus, maybe in part at least, is because we pulled that forward to a time when it should have been impossible. And then once it was done, we kind of had to wait and let technology catch up. The reason that Blue Origin and SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and all these companies today, any of these private companies, the only reason that we can do this kind of endeavor at all is because we're standing on the shoulders of NASA, who invented all of this technology. We're still using all the things that they invented back in the 60s. We have refined versions of it. But even the computer codes that we use to validate our designs have been honed and fine-tuned by NASA over decades. So this is, I think we're finally entering, I believe that we are entering a new golden age of space and space exploration. And that the time has come for that to happen because we as a species have up-leveled ourselves in terms of technology. We're ready to do it now. It's amazing that we did it in 1969.
So
it's crazy.
For a massive multi-part modular space station, mostly launched by New Glenn. Now, New Glenn is bigger than Falcon 9. Its payload fairing can put much larger payloads in there, but it's not as big as Starship. And so some of the modules on this are inflatable modules, and these are being developed by Sierra Space. We've actually seen concrete hardware. Well, not concrete, obviously, because it has to be flexible. We've actually seen physical hardware being tested and developed by Sierra Space. And by tested, I mean they overinflated the stuff until it popped, and in fact, in one case, they broke the inflation system, therefore demonstrating that, while these modules may be flexible, they are strong. Now, last year there was some murmurings that this project might be dead, that they hadn't made any announcements, that the companies weren't talking to each other, but that seems to have abated for now, and work does seem to be moving forward. But it does look like a very, very ambitious project, because building a station of this size is incredibly complicated. And no doubt it's even more complicated if you deliberately exclude SpaceX and go with like Starliner and Sierra's Dream Chaser is the only spacecraft you have to service it. But for all its ambition, it definitely has one leg up over a lot of the other options, and that is that Jeff Bezos has a lot of money, and he has been steadily shoveling money into the hole in the sky called Blue Origin, and will probably continue to do so. And this sort of orbital reef basically lines with his vision of moving manufacturing and stuff into space. Now, there are a few other concepts out there that could potentially work. I've sort of limited it to the ones which are most likely to fly. But I do want to take a moment to discuss the logistics of building a space station in orbit and how the International Space Station is different from all of these proposals. The International Space Station was constructed as a combination of the Russian Mir-2 and a US's Space Station Freedom.
I'm so sick and tired of hearing the conspiracy theory from all of these assholes about how NASA and America put up the International Space Station. Russia put up the International Space Station. As you can see here, as he just said here, the Mir-2 was originally what it was going to be called because it was the successor to the Mir. NASA does not know how to put up their own, and in '93 asked to be a part of the Mir-2 after failing with Skylab and not even trying again. So let's go over exactly how the International Space Station got placed in orbit. So in 1993, NASA became aware of it and wanted to be a part of it. And by 1996, they had constructed the thing. And so in 1998, they had it set to a Proton rocket, and they launched it and placed it in orbit. Russia launched it and placed it in orbit because Russia has the technology to do so, because they did it with the Salyut 7, they did it with the Mir, and they were going to do it with the Mir 2, which is now called the ISS, which Russia put in space. And America, just then, about a year later, started bolting things too. So just because you bolted some things onto the Russian space station doesn't mean you put it up there. And that's why you still don't know how to put one up there, and that's the problem.
And these two segments have radically different design techniques. Russia would launch its space station modules on top of rockets, and then those modules would maneuver and dock together in space. That's how Mir was built. But Space Station Freedom, and therefore the American segment of the International Space Station, was designed with a space shuttle in mind. It would carry these modules up and then it would assemble them using its manipulator arm to build the station bit by bit. And that meant that every single part on the Russian section had to have its own propulsion, navigation, its own attitude control, power capabilities, so it could autonomously navigate itself. Whereas the US segments, they didn't need any of that, so they were more efficient in terms of their mass. But now, without the space shuttle, every single module for a space station is going to have these capabilities so that it can, get to its target on its own. Now sure, Starship may one day be able to bring along a manipulator arm and a big cargo bay and do a lot of shuttle-like stuff. That is a possibility. But none of these stations are being designed with that concept in mind. Anyway, going beyond low Earth orbit, NASA is going to have its gateway station around the moon. I don't know, they keep on changing what it's actually called, but this is going to sit and it's going to provide a temporary place for NASA's astronauts to hang out as they're preparing to go to the moon or perhaps do some research out here. It's not going to be permanently occupied, but it will be another destination for NASA's astronauts. But in many ways, this will be a true successor to the International Space Station because the ISS, a lot of its work was really about learning to live in low Earth orbit, learning to, how hardware interacts and ages so that you could, say, build a spacecraft that could go to Mars. Now we know how to keep people alive for months or even years in space, but you're going out now beyond low Earth orbit. It's a different environment. There's much more radiation. We have different, thermal environments because we don't have half the sky filled with a planet. There's no 90-minute day-night cycle to contend with. And also no atomic oxygen continually eroding materials.
So while Scott Manley is giving his best Dunning-Kruger effect examples, I'm going to have to point out that I have an entire channel where he's been mentioned several times where I describe radiation outside the magnetosphere, and his limited education has helped me make a few of these videos because he doesn't know a fucking thing about deep space radiation and why we are not outside of low Earth orbit.
And this is also an international collaboration. We have, sure, the core is built by the US, but we have like Lunar IHAB, which is built by the European Space Agency with a bit of Japan's work. We have obviously Canadarm3 from Canada. So we have a number of collaborators working on the Gateway. But what about those international collaborators? What are they doing in low Earth orbit? Well, as I said, Airbus is working with Starlab, and therefore Europe has a presence on that. And Japan built the Kibo module, which was docked to the International Space Station, and there's definitely work going on towards building or designing a Japanese module for a commercial space station. But there's been no firm commitment as to which commercial space station it might become a part of. And Axiom have apparently signed on with Canada to develop their version of the Canadarm for their station. Although I am wondering whether they could just take the arm that is currently on the station. And then there's Russia. Russia has the most to lose from the end of the International Space Station. While they have their own segment, which in theory has its own power and propulsion, it has not been in good condition lately and is in fact aging faster than the rest of the station by all accounts.
So while freely admitting that Russia is the one that keeps the International Space Station in space, his complaint is that it's aged, as of course it is, and that's why they're planning on replacing it. They never expected it to last more than 20 years. It's America that's clinging on to their dying old station. Let us not forget this video is them pointing out that they're going to leave us and it's going to fall and we can't keep it up and they know that and we can't put up our own and all of the tariffs and everything won't stop them.
Now, in terms of politics, they've made a lot of moves to ally with China in recent years, but Soyuz cannot get to the Chinese space station because the inclination of that orbit is too low. They don't have that capability. They also don't have the correct docking adapters, and they cannot adapt Soyuz to get it there. So Russia is you're really facing the possibility of having no place to send its spacecraft, which is the one thing that it can do reliably right now in space. Even if Russia fixes its reputation with the international community, it will not be in a position to work with any of the commercial stations because they make more sense in lower inclination orbits. The only one that would make sense to still be in an orbit accessible by Russia is Axiom space station, because it's being built on the International Space Station, therefore has to maintain the same orbital parameters. Now, Roscosmos absolutely has wonderful designs for a space station that will actually orbit in a sun-synchronous orbit, which would be pretty cool, but of course they don't have any money, and it's unlikely that they will develop this and launch it in time for there to be a continuous presence of cosmonauts in space.
That's absolutely great and all, but Russia has been the only one to successfully put up space stations as here Skylab fell, and then they never tried it again, and Apollo-Soyuz was their closest attempt to work with them outside of the current International Space Station. Salyut was a success, and the following Mir was a success, and of course the International Space Station has been a great success, and don't forget they're the ones who put it there. So I'd imagine while he's saying it's a grand idea and a great plan, I have no doubt that Russia will pull it off as they have every single previous one.
Unless maybe China offers them a ride to space to their space station. So yeah, China's station is in a 40-degree inclination orbit which can't be reached from any of Russia's launch sites. The space station that they have has 3 major modules, and like I said, it wasn't built like the International Space Station. It was built with modules that were self-propelled, that would dock themselves onto the station, and then they would use like a small manipulator system to be able to move the module from the initial docking port around to the secondary, like to the lateral ports. So these 3 modules that we have form the backbone of the station right now, but they could potentially expand it more. There's another capability that is coming to the Chinese space station, and that is a space telescope, which will orbit in the same orbit as the China's space station, but it will periodically return and be captured so that it can be serviced and have its instrumentation changed out. Much like the Hubble Space Telescope was upgraded over its lifetime, their space telescope will be upgraded. The reason you don't have it permanently docked to the space station is that as people move around, it causes vibration, and that makes it very hard to point. So it's much easier to have it flying free on its own. And so anyway, coming back to that initial picture of the D-orbit vehicle for the International Space Station, it is effectively going to be a Dragon with a much larger trunk. It's going to use an existing Dragon spacecraft on the front, which will presumably operate autonomously. I think it's going to have over 20 tons of propellant. At the bottom, there is a ring of 30 Draco thrusters, because they need to be able to push the space station down relatively quickly within like a fraction of an orbit, so that they can target the impact site over the ocean accurately. And you might wonder, why is it not using like the Super Draco thrusters? Well, they actually would deliver way too much thrust. They can't use like the Merlin or the Raptor because those require cryogenic propellants, and this would have to sit on orbit for potentially years as it's maintaining the spacecraft's orientation and bringing the station down slowly. And by the way, while this is based on a Dragon, I don't think we should call it a Dragon because, well, look at the way that propulsion works. It's not dragging the station, it's pushing the station. It's a pushing. But honestly, if I was to come up with a name for a spacecraft which was synonymous with destroying hard work in space, it would have to be Untitled Spacecraft. But jokes aside, you might wonder, where's SpaceX in all of this? I mean, why aren't they proposing a successor space station for the US? And they might well have. And I think if they did, they might have simply proposed making Starship the space station. Now, granted, this might be Starship with a bunch of solar panels and thermal radiators to allow them to actually operate in orbit for an extended period of time. But, Starship has a phenomenal amount of internal volume, and it could absolutely operate like the Space Shuttle did with the Space Lab technology, where they would have a lab in the cargo bay or the payload bay of the space shuttle, which could do experiments for a couple of weeks and then it could be brought back. The experiments could be, changed out and then it could fly again. This is the kind of approach which might actually make sense for a number of customers, and if they truly have a reusable Starship, that's what we might see replacing a lot of on-orbit experiments. Regardless, when the International Space Station is decommissioned, whether it is deorbited or whether somebody sees the light and puts it into a storage orbit, I think there will be no lack of places to go in orbit, and that humanity will continue operating in low Earth orbit, more or less continuously from this point onwards. I gotta believe that. It's the future that I want to see. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.